The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. The soft hum of cicadas filled the air, a typical afternoon in the peaceful neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. Yet, on that fateful day, the tranquility would be shattered by a violent act that no one saw coming. The peaceful street, the carefully manicured lawns, and the families who lived there were about to be thrust into a nightmare that would shake them to their core. It began with something as simple as a flower pot, a small, innocent flower pot, carefully placed on a front porch, a token of the home's beauty and charm. Yet, to one woman in the neighborhood, it became the catalyst for a tragedy that no one could have foreseen. What started as a minor dispute over a flower pot quickly escalated into something far worse. It wasn't just a flower pot that was at stake, it was a battle over control, a question of power, and a horrifying reflection of the lengths someone would go to maintain dominance. The woman at the center of the controversy was known to everyone in the neighborhood, and not for good reasons. She was the HOA, Karen, a woman whose grip on the community's rules was as tight as her need to enforce them. A self-appointed gatekeeper of morality and order, she believed her job was to ensure that everyone adhered to her standards, whether they liked it or not. And for the residents of the neighborhood, that often meant enduring her scrutiny and harsh judgments. It was a daily reminder of the ever-present tension between the residents and the HOA, a constant reminder that the peacefulness of a neighborhood could be upended by the smallest infraction. But it wasn't just about a flower pot. It was about a mother's desperate need to protect her child and a neighbor's unyielding sense of entitlement. It was about the heartbreaking reality that one wrong move could push someone to the edge, unleashing violence in the most unexpected form. The disabled daughter, unable to defend herself or fight back, was the victim of a senseless act of aggression that would forever change the course of their lives. A mother's love for her child and a mother's fury at the injustice of it all set the stage for a confrontation that no one could have predicted. The neighborhood, once filled with the sounds of children playing, of neighbors chatting over the fence, was now consumed by the echo of gunshots, the sound that pierced the calm, the sound that would forever haunt the streets. It was in broad daylight, during a time when the community was supposed to feel safe, that this violence unfolded. And all of this chaos, was over a flower pot. The emotional stakes were high. The disabled daughter, who had spent her life battling adversity, was now fighting for her life. The mother, faced with the unbearable pain of seeing her child harmed, was thrust into a battle she never imagined. A battle that would not only test her strength, but her faith in the very community she had trusted. The trauma of that day would linger long after the ambulance left, long after the police took their statements, long after the neighborhood returned to what it had once been. But nothing would ever be the same again. What followed was a journey into a world of injustice, where rules were twisted and power was abused. The HOA Karen, whose obsession with control had led her down this dark path, now found herself at the center of a legal battle that would expose her true nature. And as the family fought to regain their peace, they would discover that the true fight was not just against a woman's power. It was against a system that had allowed her to wield it unchecked for far too long. It was a fight for justice, a fight for the disabled daughter who had been shot for nothing more than existing in a space she was supposed to feel safe, and for a mother whose love for her child was stronger than anything the HOA Karen could ever take away. For weeks leading up to that fateful afternoon, there had been whispers, arguments, and simmering resentment in the quiet neighborhood. The once friendly interactions between the residents had slowly eroded under the heavy hand of the HOA Karen, a woman whose obsession with the rules seemed to grow with every passing day. It wasn't just the flower pot that ignited the fire, it was the culmination of months, even years, of tension that had been building between the HOA Karen and the families who lived there. The neighborhood, once a model of suburban serenity, had become a battlefield where every inch of property was scrutinized and every minor violation became grounds for conflict. The HOA Karen, who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, saw herself as the guardian of order and decorum. For her, The flower pot was a symbol, a line in the sand, a test of whether anyone dared to defy her. To her, the smallest infraction was a threat to her power, and she wouldn't stand for it. Whether it was a blade of grass growing a fraction too high or a decoration that didn't meet her standards, she saw herself as the enforcer of community rules. But for the family at the center of this story, it wasn't just about a flower pot. It was about a sense of peace, a safe place where they could exist without fear of being judged, criticized, or attacked. The disabled daughter, who had spent her life confined to a wheelchair, had always found solace in the simple things, like the flower pot her mother had placed on their porch. It wasn't a grand gesture, nor was it something that could easily be dismissed. The flower pot represented a small victory in a life filled with challenges. It was her mother's way of bringing beauty into their world, of making her daughter feel included in the things that others took for granted. Every day, the daughter would gaze at the flowers, their vibrant colors a reminder that despite everything, beauty still existed in their lives. But to the HOA Karen, the flower pot was an eyesore. It didn't belong. It wasn't in line with her idea of what the neighborhood should look like. In her eyes, it was another act of defiance, a challenge to her authority. And she would not tolerate it. She had already made her disapproval known on multiple occasions with passive-aggressive comments and unnecessary complaints. But when the flower pot remained, she saw it as a direct challenge, one that needed to be answered with the full weight of her power. It was on that bright, sunny afternoon that the tension finally reached its breaking point. The air was warm but not oppressive, and the neighborhood was buzzing with activity. Children were playing in the street, and neighbors were tending to their gardens. From the outside, it seemed like just another peaceful day. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. The HOA Karen had been watching the flower pot for days, her frustration growing as it remained in place, an unspoken symbol of resistance to her control. When she finally walked across the street to the family's house, her face was set in a hard, angry expression. She approached the front porch with a sense of purpose, her gaze fixed on the flower pot. "This is unacceptable," she muttered under her breath, her voice laced with venom. She had come to make her stand, to put an end to what she perceived as a rebellion against her authority. The mother, who had been inside tending to her daughter, saw the Karen approaching through the window. Her heart sank. She had dealt with the HOA Karen before, and each encounter had left her feeling more powerless and drained. But she wasn't prepared for what was about to unfold. As the Karen stepped onto the porch, her anger boiling over, the mother rushed to the door to confront her. "This is our home," the mother said, trying to keep her voice steady, but the frustration was clear. "You can't dictate what we do here. We're not hurting anyone. This flower pot is important to my daughter." But the HOA Karen was beyond reasoning. Her eyes burned with rage, and she spoke with an air of superiority. "You've defied me for the last time. This is my neighborhood, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep it in line," she sneered. The mother's frustration turned to fear. She knew that the Karen's words often carried weight in the community, and the damage to their reputation could be irreparable. But nothing could prepare her for what happened next. In one swift motion, the HOA Karen pulled out a weapon, pointing it directly at the disabled daughter, who had wheeled herself to the porch, unaware of the tension escalating around her. The shot rang out, shattering the peace of the neighborhood and sending the world spinning into chaos. The flower pot, which had been at the center of this conflict, now lay shattered on the ground, its petals scattered across the pavement, an ironic symbol of the destruction that had just taken place. In that moment, everything changed. The stakes were no longer just about the flower pot or the HOA Karen's power. It was about a mother's fight to protect her child and a community that would never be the same again. The neighborhood that had once felt like a safe haven was now a place of deep sorrow and rage, a place where a simple flower pot had sparked a tragedy. As the sirens wailed in the distance, the reality of what had just occurred began to sink in. The stakes were higher than ever, and the fight for justice had only just begun. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting an amber glow over the neighborhood, but the warmth of the evening did little to soothe the growing tension on the porch. The flower pot, with its vibrant blooms, sat innocently by the door, now the focal point of a conflict that had escalated beyond anyone's imagination. The HOA, Karen, her face twisted with frustration, had reached the breaking point. Her hands trembled with anger as she stepped onto the porch, her eyes locked onto the flower pot, and her voice, thick with bitterness, cut through the air. "This is it," she hissed, glaring at the pot. "You're pushing me too far now." The mother, who had been inside, heard the tension in the woman's voice and instinctively knew what was about to unfold. She rushed to the door, heart pounding in her chest. The disabled daughter in her wheelchair had just wheeled herself outside, drawn by the commotion. She stopped beside the pot, her eyes wide and confused, unaware of the danger rapidly closing in. She was still smiling, having spent the afternoon arranging flowers with her mother, a rare moment of peace in a world that often made her feel like an outsider. "Mom, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with concern as she noticed the HOA Karen standing just feet away, her gaze locked on the pot. The mother reached out instinctively, her protective instincts taking over. "Get inside, sweetheart," she urged, her voice shaking. "Go inside now." But before the daughter could react, the HOA Karen's temper flared. "No," she spat, her voice like ice. "You think you can just keep doing this, flaunting your defiance in front of everyone? It's not happening anymore. It's time to end this." The words hung in the air for a split second before the Karen's hand reached into her bag, pulling out something small and deadly. The mother's eyes widened as she saw the weapon glinting in the fading sunlight. Her heart skipped a beat as the reality of the situation slammed into her. There was no time to think, no time to react. The Karen's finger pulled the trigger. A deafening crack split the air, and in that instant, time seemed to slow down. The disabled daughter, still in her wheelchair, froze as the bullet struck. Her body jerked, her face twisted in shock and pain, but no sound came out. The world around her was a blur of chaos. The flower pot beside her shattered, its pieces scattering across the porch like the fragments of a peaceful life being destroyed. The mother screamed, her voice raw with terror and disbelief as she rushed to her daughter's side, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she tried to assess the damage. The once serene neighborhood where families laughed and played was now gripped by the terrifying reality of violence. The mother's hands were covered in her daughter's blood, and every frantic second felt like an eternity. She couldn't comprehend what had just happened. How could anyone, have the nerve to shoot her child over something so trivial? A flower pot. "Please, no, no, no," the mother cried out, her voice cracking as she held her daughter, desperate to stop the bleeding, her eyes wide with panic. "Stay with me, stay with me." The HOA Karen stood frozen for a moment, her wide eyes betraying a hint of hesitation. But it was brief. A moment later, she turned and started to walk away, her hands trembling as she muttered to herself, almost as though trying to justify the violence she had just committed. "She shouldn't have crossed me. She shouldn't have." The mother looked up, her mind racing, but her body was too numb to follow. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The weight of the moment crashed down on her. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt completely powerless. Her daughter, the one person she had always protected, was now fighting for her life because of the senseless cruelty of a neighbor. Moments later, the street was filled with flashing red and blue lights as the police and paramedics arrived. The mother barely noticed the officers asking questions, their voices a distant hum in her ears. She only cared about her daughter, her life slipping away too fast in her arms. The paramedics rushed to work, stabilizing her daughter as they loaded her onto a stretcher, and the mother could only watch in helpless horror as they whisked her away to the ambulance. The police officer tried to get a statement from her, but she was too disoriented to respond. Her gaze locked on the ambulance as it pulled away. It was as if everything around her had become a blur, the world suddenly moving in slow motion. The HOA Karen, standing at the end of the street, had already started to backpedal, but the police weren't letting her off that easily. One officer called out to her, his voice commanding, "Ma'am, stop right there. We need to talk to you." The tension in the air was thick, and as the Karen turned around, her face a mask of feigned innocence, the audience was left with an unresolved question. Could this really be justified as self-defense? Would the family ever see justice? And would the HOA Karen face any real consequences for her actions, or would she walk away, unscathed, like so many others before her? As the scene unfolded, one thing became clear. This was only the beginning of a much darker journey, and the family's fight for justice had just begun. The aftermath of that tragic day was a blur of flashing lights, frantic phone calls, and police interrogations. The neighborhood, which had once been so peaceful, was now buzzing with the news of the shooting. Neighbors who had once waved at each other across lawns now looked at one another with distrust. Some whispered behind closed doors, while others stood on their porches, casting sideways glances toward the house where it had all happened. But amidst the shock, one thing was clear. Everyone had a side to the story, and no one was willing to give up theirs. The mother was devastated, but she was determined. She couldn't stand the thought that her daughter's life had been shattered over a mere flower pot, something so trivial it almost seemed absurd. She knew her fight for justice would be uphill, especially with the HOA Karen already spinning her own version of events. It was no longer just about the violence. It was about the systematic abuse of power that had been quietly festering in the neighborhood for years. The Karen wasn't just some angry neighbor. She was a force that had wielded her power unchecked for far too long, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. The first step was the police investigation. The officers who arrived at the scene had taken initial statements, but there was a noticeable hesitation in the air. No one wanted to point fingers just yet, especially with the Karen's reputation and her long-standing role in the community. She had connections, allies within the HOA, and her voice carried weight. It was difficult for some people to believe that she could be capable of such an act. After all, who would suspect the woman who was always quick to enforce the smallest of infractions? Who would think she could turn that controlling nature into something so violent? But the mother wasn't backing down. Her daughter's life was at stake, and she wasn't going to let anyone sweep this under the rug. She began to speak out, telling anyone who would listen about the history of tension between her family and the Karen. Neighbors who had been silent before began to open up, sharing their own stories of the Karen's oppressive behavior. They spoke of how she had controlled the neighborhood with an iron fist, issuing fines for the slightest rule violations, from not trimming the grass to minor infractions like leaving a child's toy out in the yard. But no one had expected it to escalate this far. No one had imagined she would resort to violence. Still, the Karen continued to deny any malicious intent. She told the police that she had acted out of fear, that she had felt threatened by the disabled daughter, who had allegedly been too close to her property. The police weren't convinced, but they had no solid evidence yet. There were no witnesses to the actual shooting, just the mother's word against the Karens. The Karen maintained that she had been defending herself and claimed she had never meant to harm anyone. The weapon, a small handgun she kept for self-defense, had been discharged, but the Karen was adamant that it had been an accident. She said she had tripped and the gun went off by mistake. The community, once united, was now divided. Some residents believed the Karen story. They whispered that the family must have done something to provoke her, that they must have been in the wrong. Others rallied behind the mother, appalled at the violence that had been inflicted on a defenseless child. As the investigation dragged on, rumors began to spread, and the lines between right and wrong became increasingly blurred. The HOA Karen supporters, armed with their own selective interpretations of the events, began to sway public opinion. The neighborhood was at war with itself. Meanwhile, the family was left to pick up the pieces. The mother, still reeling from the traumatic event, had to fight not only for her daughter's life, but for her dignity. The disabled daughter, still recovering in the hospital, had to come to terms with the fact that her existence, something she had worked so hard to make peaceful, had become the catalyst for a legal battle. They were no longer just victims of a crime, they were pawns in a larger, deeply ingrained power struggle. The police were working tirelessly to gather evidence, but the Karen was skilled at manipulating the system. She had made sure her version of events was heard loud and clear, and now the family had to prove that her actions were anything but accidental. The emotional toll on the mother was mounting, and each day she watched her daughter struggle, both physically and emotionally, to recover from the trauma of that day. As the investigation continued, new layers of the conflict emerged. The Karen, feeling the pressure of mounting evidence against her, began to turn on her own allies. She started to distance herself from the very HOA board members who had once supported her, claiming that they had misled her into thinking she was above reproach. She even began to undermine the family's credibility, spreading rumors about their character and trying to paint them as the true aggressors in the situation. But despite her attempts to discredit them, the family refused to back down. The mother's determination only grew stronger as the days passed, fueled by the relentless desire for justice for her daughter. She knew the fight wasn't just for her family, it was for the entire neighborhood. The HOA Karen's abuse of power couldn't be allowed to continue, and this was their chance to bring it to light. The stakes had never been higher, and the rising conflict was only getting more intense. The family's fight for justice was no longer just about one flower pot. It was a battle to hold the Karen accountable for her actions and to restore a sense of fairness to a community that had long been ruled by fear and control. The courtroom was filled with a heavy tension as the legal battle that had been building for months finally reached its peak. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Each side had prepared for this day, knowing that everything they had fought for would be determined here. The family, still shaken from the events that had unraveled their lives, sat quietly at the back of the courtroom, their hearts heavy with hope and fear. The mother, who had been the voice of reason throughout the entire ordeal, could barely bring herself to look at the woman who had shot her daughter. The HOA Karen stood at the front, composed and calculating, her icy demeanor never wavering. The trial began with the prosecutor outlining the case, an unjustified shooting over a flower pot that had shattered the peace of an entire neighborhood. The family's lawyer spoke, passionately, detailing the events of that tragic afternoon and the emotional toll it had taken on the disabled daughter. The daughter, who had been forced to endure not only the physical pain of the shooting, but the trauma of feeling like a target, was the emotional centerpiece of the trial. Her testimony was heart-wrenching. With each word, she relived the horror of that day, her voice trembling as she described the moment she had been shot. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of her words sinking deep into the hearts of everyone present. Despite the raw emotion in the room, the Karen remained unfazed. She sat with a smug expression, her lawyer presenting a defense that was both manipulative and calculated. She claimed the shooting was an accident, a mere slip of the hand, that her fear of the disabled daughter had caused her to react in a moment of panic. But the Karen's defense was anything but believable. As her lawyer continued to argue that she had acted in self-defense, the cracks in her story began to show. The prosecutor quickly exposed inconsistencies in her version of events, asking why she hadn't called the police immediately if she had been truly afraid. Why had she stood on the porch, calmly walking away from the scene, instead of trying to help the victim? The questions came fast, one after another, and each one pushed the Karen further into a corner. The twists came unexpectedly. It turned out that the Karen had a history of similar outbursts, though they had never escalated to violence before. As the prosecution presented evidence of her previous confrontations with neighbors, the once spotless image of the HOA, Karen, began to crumble. Witnesses came forward, speaking of how she had aggressively pursued even the smallest infractions, from barking dogs to improperly parked cars, with a zeal that bordered on obsession. But no one had ever expected her to go this far. No one had imagined that her need for control would push her to shoot an innocent, disabled child. The emotional toll on the family was evident. The mother, who had fought for months to bring attention to her daughter's suffering, was exhausted. Her voice cracked as she testified, her words trembling with the weight of the years spent trying to protect her daughter. She spoke of the helplessness she felt when she saw her child lying on the ground, bleeding from a gunshot wound, all because of a petty argument over a flower pot. Her pain was palpable and the courtroom could feel it. The disabled daughter, still recovering from her injuries, sat beside her mother, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. She had been the one to suffer the most, and yet she had become the symbol of strength and resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship. Her presence was a testament to the family's determination to seek justice, no matter the cost. Then came the turning point. As the trial neared its conclusion, the defense tried one final tactic to manipulate the jury. The Karen's lawyer suggested that the mother had exaggerated the emotional impact of the shooting, claiming that the entire ordeal had been blown out of proportion. But this was the moment that turned the tide. A key piece of evidence, one that had been overlooked until then, was presented: a security camera footage from a neighbor's house that showed the entire confrontation. In the footage, the Karen was clearly seen walking onto the porch with intent, not reacting out of fear, but with deliberate aggression. The shot was fired without any sign of panic. It was cold, calculated, and deliberate. The courtroom gasped as the footage played, and the Karen's defense crumbled. The jury was left with no doubt about her guilt. The high-stakes moment had arrived, and it was clear that the Karen's lies had caught up with her. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted as the weight of the truth settled in. As the trial came to a close, the final argument was delivered. The mother, her voice steady but filled with the emotion of the months spent fighting for her daughter's justice, asked the jury for accountability. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice echoing in the courtroom. "This is about all of us. It's about ensuring that no one has the power to hurt others without consequence. It's about protecting our children, our families, and our communities from people who think they are above the law." The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity, the tension in the room unbearable. And when the verdict was finally delivered, it was clear. The HOA Karen was guilty. Her actions had been driven by a thirst for power and control, and she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The family, exhausted but relieved, finally felt the weight of the burden lift from their shoulders. The journey was far from over, but for the first time since that tragic day, they had won. Justice had been served. The gavel came down with a resonant bang, and in that moment, the air in the courtroom seemed to shift. The jury had deliberated, and the verdict was final. The HOA Karen, the woman whose actions had upended the lives of an entire family, was convicted. The weight of the decision hung heavily over everyone present, but for the mother and her daughter, the feeling wasn't one of triumph. It was a bittersweet relief. Justice had been served, but the emotional toll of the entire ordeal had left scars that would never fully heal. As the court adjourned, the mother sat still, staring at the gavel that had just sealed the fate of the woman who had harmed her child. Her heart was heavy, but there was a sense of closure that she hadn't felt since the day of the shooting. She looked over at her daughter, who was still recovering from her physical injuries, though the emotional wounds were deeper than anyone could have predicted. Her daughter had been through so much: hospital stays, therapy, the harrowing memory of the day she was shot. But now, she had something she had fought so hard for: justice. It was a step forward, a moment that would allow them both to start healing. As they left the courtroom, the outside world seemed to fade away. The streets that once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a battlefield, scarred by what had happened. But the mother felt a sense of pride as she held her daughter's hand. They had fought together, and in the end, they had won not just a legal victory, but a personal one. The HOA Karen would no longer have the power to control their lives, to make them feel small, to threaten their peace. The following weeks were a whirlwind of media attention, public opinions, and emotional aftermath. The news of the trial spread across the neighborhood, and the reaction was mixed. Some residents were relieved that the truth had come to light, while others, still loyal to the Karen, tried to downplay the severity of the situation. But the family was no longer concerned with the opinions of those who had stood by in silence while the Karen's reign of terror continued. What mattered was that they had stood up for what was right, and they had made a difference. In the privacy of their home, the family began the long process of recovery. The daughter, still fragile, was slowly returning to her old routine. She began therapy not just for the physical wounds, but for the trauma she had endured. The weight of the shooting, the fear, and the overwhelming sense of vulnerability would take time to heal. But with her mother by her side, she felt a sense of security she hadn't felt in months. The mother, too, found herself changed by the experience. The anger and pain that had consumed her during the trial slowly gave way to a quiet, resolute strength. She had learned that sometimes, even when the world feels like it's closing in, standing up for the ones you love can change everything. As they sat together in the living room one evening, the daughter turned to her mother, her eyes filled with gratitude. "We did it, didn't we?" she asked, a soft smile tugging at the corners of her lips. The mother nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Yes, sweetheart, we did it together." But as they reflected on the journey they had endured, the reality of what had happened set in. The family would never be the same again. The memories of the shooting, the trial, and the emotional toll would always be with them, reminders of a time when their lives had been violently disrupted by a senseless act. Yet despite it all, they had emerged stronger, more united than ever before. The final chapter of the story wasn't just about the legal victory, it was about resilience. It was about the unbreakable bond between a mother and her daughter, a bond that had been tested in unimaginable ways. It was about the courage to face down fear, to challenge authority, and to never back down, even when the odds were stacked against them. As the story closed, there was a sense of emotional closure for the family. They had faced the darkest of times and come out on the other side, scarred but not broken. The Karen had been held accountable, but the family knew that true healing would take time. The journey toward peace would not be immediate, but with each day, they took one step closer to reclaiming the life they once had. And though their scars would remain, they would never forget the strength they had found in one another. The message was clear. Sometimes the fight for justice isn't just about winning. It's about standing tall in the face of adversity, protecting those we love, and proving that even in the most broken moments, there's always hope. As we close the chapter on this heartbreaking yet empowering journey, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the outcome of this case? Do you believe justice was truly served? Share your opinions in the comments below, and don't forget to hit the like button if you felt moved by this story. If you want to stay updated on more stories like this, real-life battles, powerful moments, and unforgettable justice, make sure to subscribe to the HOA Stories. By subscribing, you're not just supporting the channel, you're joining a community of people who believe in standing up for what's right. So, don't miss out. Hit that notification bell, and let's continue this journey together. Until next time, stay strong, stay engaged, and keep fighting for justice.